Hey folks, it's Sadesh, and you are back with another episode of CloudStream. And we're covering today somebody who I'm really excited about that participates in a lot of open source software, as well as kind of leading the efforts for some SaaS stuff. But enough about me. Let me talk about Mauricio. Will you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, Sudesh. Yes, my name is Mauricio Salatino. I do work for VMware in the Knative project on the open source side, and I'm super excited to be here.
Nice. And on that Knative project, what are you focused on there? What are you really kind of doing within the Knative space?
I am super passionate about like user experience and making sure that developers can have kind of like a nice experience when they're using the software. So I've been working a lot now on building conformance around it for going 1.0 pretty soon. So I'm really pushing for making sure that we have everything we need for the 1.0 release, and just helping the community to get there. And I'm really
Nice.
looking forward for that to happen as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I understand once you hit 1.0, you've got some plans for the next year. What are you going to be focused on next year?
Yeah, so next year I've been probably looking into functions and the Funk project, because I'm really interested in kind of like developer tools and how they use these things to build their own applications and their own platforms. So I think that that's a perfect kind of like project that I will be working on, because it's pretty aligned with my passions.
Nice. One thing we always ask folks, especially when they're involved with open source work, is how they got started. A lot of folks face a challenge when they learn about open source. If they've particularly been a closed source developer before, they find it a little bit daunting. Sometimes it's like, I don't know anybody over there. Like, I don't know, how to get in. But what I thought was interesting about your background is you got to start pretty early. I think university. Would you tell us a little bit about how you got started?
Yeah, definitely. So when I was like going to my university back there in Argentina, I had the luck to have a professor who was very involved with the Linux kernel and the networking part of the Linux kernel. So he was talking about like a lot of C, of course, because it's the Linux kernel, also going really deep, but also like has a lot of strong roots in the open source communities. And I got like really into that and started working my way up, because in order to kind of like reach into open source, you first need to develop your own applications, learn your language, and and go deeper. I'm not so much into operating systems, so I started building applications, and I quickly entered kind of like the middleware space. And in the middleware space back then, like JBoss was a big thing. So I started like looking into the projects and collaborating and getting involved. It's all about spending time. If you really want to participate in open source, you spend time, and then you just understand how the project works, and then you start contributing.
Nice. Now, just for our viewers out there, when you were focused on middleware, what specific functions were you focused on? Were you, integration?
Yeah.
What kind of stuff?
Yeah, I was doing a lot of system integration frameworks. I've been working on building frameworks for the last 10 years of my career, which took me to this specific point in time where Kubernetes is a big thing. I've been using Kubernetes for a long time. I've been building frameworks and abstractions for a long time. So now I'm combining these two passions, like cloud, Kubernetes, and building abstractions and frameworks like Knative.
Nice. And so that led to your early work, I think, right? When you were kind of back in 2016, you were starting to build out on Kubernetes. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was pretty lucky to start very, very early with Kubernetes, and because it was open source, it was very aligned with the stuff that I was doing. And because I was working on the Java middleware stuff there at JBoss, I started realizing that we will need to start migrating all these things into in order to be able to run them on top of Kubernetes and using containers. And I noticed also that it's not a problem that only JBoss faced. Most of the Java companies like that were selling products, they need to migrate more like into software as a service approach, and that usually take them to that kind of like space of thinking about how do we re-architect stuff for running on top of Kubernetes.
Now, I really like this particular track, not only because I love the title of your session at KubeCon, which is tools that I wish existed 3 years ago to build a SaaS offering. But here's one of the things that I kind of found interesting about this talk in general was what do you have to figure out as you're going through that process? So for people who are watching, a lot of times we as devs, we only see the part of the tool chain we care about, right? We don't see the whole thing. We're just like, oh, well, I managed to get this piece of code done. It works and it's shipped, and that's I'll go on to the next thing. Can you talk about the wider challenges that you see so that others can understand that?
Yeah, 100%. And I think I've seen this like in different companies. After working in JBoss, I left and I started working with smaller companies, I would say, all going into kind of like that approach or trying to figure out how to go there, right? It's a company culture change on moving from product to software as a service. It's also going to the cloud and making a decision on which cloud provider is the best. And pretty early on for me, because I was already working with Kubernetes before, it was crystal clear that Kubernetes was the way to go, right? It was the way for us to abstract different cloud providers and to build stuff that can be, provisioned and run into different kind of like providers, no matter where you're working on. In general, for companies, that's kind of like the first step, understanding kind of like what tools that they need to use and what are kind of like the APIs that they are going to be relying on. And then building that kind of like mindset of pivoting fast. And, if you make a bad decision, just go back and revert that and make sure that you are on the right track. And then looking into open source projects for me was fundamental to see what are the innovations happening in that space, right? Like what's going on in the industry, what's going on in different companies that was not my own at that time. So I got involved with different open source projects that basically teach me how people were actually using Kubernetes and pushing Kubernetes forward. And I would 100% like recommend that for people that it's in that position of designing a software as a service platform on top of Kubernetes. Just go out there, look into what the open source communities are doing, and just try to retrofit that into your own designs and your own practices.
Yeah. Now, with that being said, I think what's important for folks to know is what your session is going to be covering. And you mentioned a couple of tools that I think everybody knows exist, right? But they're not necessarily aware of how to put them together. And I think the secret here is how they can work together. What are those tools?
Yeah, so I'm covering a bit of Helm, Tecton, I'm covering Knative, I'm covering Crossplane as well. And I was planning to cover a bit of like Captain as well, which is another interesting open source project. But I will just try to keep it as simple as possible to make sure that what people can take away from the presentation is that they can go tomorrow to their working environments and just try the examples that I'm showing, so they get a little bit less scared about the tools and how they work. And also how you can combine these things in order to build those kind of platforms, which share a lot of like similar characteristics and features, right? Like you have customers, you want them to have like isolated environments so they can provision their own software, that kind of stuff.
Okay, so I think one of the things that you mentioned earlier that we haven't covered yet was you've helped a couple of these organizations actually go through this process. I think that's one thing that's particularly helpful is having that practitioner experience. Will you tell us a little bit of who were those organizations and kind of what did you help them do to get to SaaS? Like what was that process like?
In general, it was all about like making sure that their projects and their products were like architected in a way that they can be moved into SaaS, right? And there were like software providers in general. That's my experience, like software providers. So software providers, they have a completely different set of requirements compared to like an end user provider, right? Like if you're Netflix, you just install the app and you just interact with it.
You're done.
If you're a software provider, you always need to have in mind, can my customers run this software into this specific cloud provider that I chose? Or do they want to run this SaaS platform in their own, like in their own prem clusters on top of their own kind of like metal installation? And that's a different kind of like design mindset, and it's also like a different set of requirements that push you to think about abstractions. So in general, my work was all about that, finding the right abstractions out there in the community and finding how those abstractions can be applied to in some way re-architect their products.
This brings up a good point, because when we first talked, I said what were some of the challenges that you face with Knative? And I think a good point you brought up, which is just a pretty basic one, was what it does. Like, what's the functional purpose for Knative? And would you walk us through what that is? Like, what, in
Mhm.
your opinion?
We had like recently a tweet from Kelsey, and he was saying that that if Kubernetes is the electrical grid, Knative is like the electric switch, like the light switch there, which
Hmm.
is basically going along the lines of saying that Kubernetes is basically just a set of tools and a set of
Hmm.
abstractions that will make your life easier when you're building cloud native applications, right? So again, it's just a collection of features and a collection of mechanisms that will just make your life easier, and
Hmm.
that's why it's kind of like split it in two independent modules. You have Knative serving and Knative eventing.
Yep.
While Knative servings simplifies the way of kind of like defining what the service is and routing traffic to that specific service, plus
Hmm.
adding all the auto scaling and scaling down to zero capabilities. Eventing brings the abstractions of producers and consumer of events. That is something that in the Kubernetes world kind of like doesn't exist, and
Yeah.
you definitely ended up like using events and building event-driven architectures, or at least
Yeah.
some aspects of your applications will be event-driven. So that's kind of like where Knative fits. And to be honest, nowadays, if I see someone using Kubernetes, I usually wonder why they are not using Knative, because it's such a useful tool and such a mature project as well.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, because I think a lot of times folks, going back to Kelsey's Kubernetes the hard way, they learn the abstraction, but they don't have any meta model to apply the abstraction in a way that makes productivity sense, and
Yeah,
they kind of bump around a little bit trying to figure
and
that out.
yeah, and I think that Tecton is pretty much doing the same, right? Like bringing those abstractions about how to build software and create pipelines on top of Kubernetes that Kubernetes doesn't have. And
Hmm.
you will see more and more of these projects like coming with their own abstractions, so we can build, software that works without reinventing all these layers inside of our own software.
Yeah, this is brilliant. I think one of the best ways that people can contribute to the community is sharing what they learn. And with that, I hear or you are an author. Will you tell us a little bit about what you're writing?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm writing a book called Continuous Delivery for Kubernetes, and this is
Hmm.
from the lens of the developer, right? Like I consider myself a developer, so I'm
Yeah,
writing about all the tools that can make you more efficient while building applications on top of Kubernetes. And that's why I'm covering kind of like similar tools that I'm covering in my KubeCon presentation. It's going along the same lines. How do you
yeah,
save time, and how do you use the right abstractions to simplify your life, right? When you're building this very complex distributed software.
nice. Well, I think if you guys take a look here at the URL, you should be able to find that publication. Very excited. Is this your first book?
It's not my first book. I've
Okay.
written some other like frameworks books before about like
Yeah.
business process management and rules management. That was like long time ago. This is like full on Kubernetes. So I totally recommend you to join. It's kind of like the early access program. That basically
Okay.
means that I'm writing and I'm publishing every month a new chapter. So if you
Yeah.
join at this stage, you can just send reviews, and we can get it better for everyone.
Awesome. I like the collaborative approach. Now,
Hmm.
when you're not focused on giving great talks, sharing your knowledge, what are you passionate about? What do you do for fun outside of work?
Well, lately I've been playing a lot of tennis here in the UK. Like since I moved here to London like 10 years ago, I realized that if you want to play tennis here, it's pretty easy compared to Argentina. So
Yeah.
I've been taking advantage of that and just going out and play as much as I can while the summer lasts.
Nice. All right. And if folks want to find you online, what's the best way for them to kind of figure out what you're thinking, what you're
Mhm.
doing, and what you might be participating in?
So I have two main things, right? Like, so I have my Twitter account where I'm at Salaboy, and
Okay.
I also have my blog, which is salaboy.com.
All right, great. Well, hey, it's been great speaking with you, Mauricio. I want to thank you for taking the time, and I look forward to maybe seeing you at a KubeCon in the near future in person as well as virtually, just depending on how folks are feeling out there. And we'll definitely have to follow up with you as you get into kind of what's beyond that Knative release 1.0.
Mhm.
Thanks again for joining.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sudesh. It was a pleasure.